Steve mentions, yes, I did do up stickers for the Guinness Book of World Records, or the Guinness World Records. Just found a Guinness World Records graphic online, and just had Studio Comics Press cobble something together. And I've been trying to figure out a way to incorporate that with the Cerebus trade paperback on what I think is kind of the sensible assumption that nobody's heard of Dave Sim, and nobody's heard of Cerebus, and nobody's heard of any of the individual books, but they have heard of the Guinness World Records. So, you know, it's one of those things. Maybe all you got to do is get them to stop and look at the cover for 5 seconds, and if that piques their curiosity, maybe they'll pick up the book and look at it. But I don't think I have enough confidence in that to print up enough stickers for all of Diamond's inventory and have Diamond put them on there. So it is something that I have thought about. I do have one Cerebus trade paperback with one sticker on the front of it. I should probably auction that on one of the weekly updates. This is the only one with a Guinness World Records sticker on it to date. Anybody interested? I can't guarantee that this will be the only one that ever exists, but it's probably going to be the only one that says 2018.
Well, plus it's the first one. I mean, you'll get the collector of, well, I need, like, Nate Oberstein will probably be the guy beating everybody else up trying to get it because, well, this is the 1/1 edition.
Right. Yeah, as long as I write it on there, that should help. Then the part in Steve's letters. So my 50th birthday was in 2017. As you may recall, I share a birthday with Deni, and I've always wondered what significance you would find in that fact, since you always find significance in any set of dates. That's a very good point, and yeah, this is the first time this year that I knew that, because Steve bought one of the Neil Adams birthday cards. So definitely when I was writing out his birthday card to him and noticed that it was September 30th, I went, well, that maybe doesn't explain a great deal, but it certainly fits as a jigsaw puzzle piece. I think one of the things that occurs to me out of that is in breaking up with Deni, I think forward and backward in time, in puncture of time, which is how time operates on the upper levels, everything happens simultaneously. I think that Deni was definitely a question mark to me, not knowing that I was going to end up being a devout monotheist. At least I hope I end up a devout monotheist. I have been one for almost 25 years now. Deni was definitely in the category of Steve Peters' spirituality versus God. First of all, taking Steve's name, the two sides of his name. Steve, on the one side, has always, I think, in North American society, Steve has always been associated with Stephen King, who is, sort of definitely the Stephen King of incorporating the infernal into the commonplace and fictionalizing that and becoming the central figure in that, in impunity, you are participating in that if you're documenting that. Even if you think you're fictionalizing that, you have no idea the extent to which you're fictionalizing that and the extent to which you are actually over in the infernal, which is part of the spirituality argument of if you believe in spirituality divorced from God. In other words, you're not religious, you're not a monotheist, but you believe that a realm of spirit exists, and you do believe in being a spiritual person. I am persuaded now, and I certainly wasn't persuaded at the time that I was with Deni, and at the time after Deni, which is when I started hearing from Steve Peters. I definitely used to think that, yes, there is a spiritual component to life, but no, I don't believe in particularly in God. I don't believe in Scripture. I don't believe in churches. Blah blah blah. The whole John Lennon Imagine kind of thing. I think that definitely Deni came from that sort of a background as well, but was posed as a question. The great love of her life, at least before we met, was a guy named Steve who was a Zen Buddhist in Palo Alto or the San Francisco area. And one of the things that brought their relationship to an end was that they were filling out a questionnaire or having a discussion about their future plans and what their plan involved. And Deni's plan definitely revolved around being with Steve, and Steve's plan didn't have Deni in it, which came as a colossal shock to her, obviously. So that was one of those spirituality things where is Zen Buddhism God-oriented, or is it spirituality divorced from God? So that was another Steve. And then, of course, I have in the comic book field, around the time that I was corrupting myself with Judith, along comes Swamp Thing with Steve Bissett. So I was, if you get the logic of this, Steve Bissett, Besset. I was beset by Steve, and that became another element of, am I going to be beset by Steve and get swept into the infernal side of things, which Steve is very, very fond of and doesn't think there's any kind of harm or self-destructiveness in it? Or am I going to beset Steve, which tended to be more of the way that things went, particularly when he was persuaded to self-publish, and his pathological procrastination no longer worked, because when you're a self-publisher, you don't have somebody telling you what to do. You only have yourself telling you what to do, which is why I always thought it was very, very amusing that he came up with a comic book called Tyrant. So that's the long way around. That's coming back to Steve's name. You've got the Steve side there, which is potentially infernal, potentially spiritual, potentially spiritual / infernal, can break up with Deni and no longer be married to her, no longer have any contact with her, but nature adores a vacuum and nature abhors a vacuum. And I think that's where Steve came into it. And it was a question of, if you have Steve, and here's all of these contexts that Dave Sim had for Steve and for the name Steve, who are the Peters in that Steve context? Who are the, as Peter is to Jesus, and Peter was both a significant figure to the Synoptic Jesus and the Johannine Jesus, who are the Peters or the Steve in Dave Sim's life? And that's a very interesting question. And Steve Peters is definitely one of the Peters who I wouldn't say we're on the same page. I think Steve's probably more of a monotheist now than he was when he was starting writing to me in 1990, and more of a monotheist than he has been all along. But relative to my own viewpoint of what is monotheistic about spirituality, I tend to be far more of a purist and an absolutist, that monotheism has to be directed towards God, and it has to involve Scripture. It can't just be, here's something that exists in the non-apparent world, consequently it's the same thing as religion, or it's the same thing as God. So there you go. Very, very long-winded explanation about why I think Steve Peters was born on September 30th, and why he has had this place in my life pretty much from the biblical 7 years after I broke up with Deni, which was 1983. Steve didn't show up in my life until 1990.
Okay.
Got any questions on that one, or?
Well, I would just, when you said that, the question of, are you and Steve on the same page, and I immediately thought, well, if you're not on the same page, you guys might be in the same book, but you're further along than he